Okay, so we are going to get started. Good timing, Marshall. Welcome. Um, and I wanted to start by talking about why I started Storytime, which I will start with a quote. That says that life is complicated is a fact of great analytic importance. And that's from The Alchemy of Race and Rights, written by Patricia Williams, professor of law and philosophy and director of law, technology, and ethics at Northeastern University. That life is complicated is a fact of great analytic importance. So I studied ethnic studies the last few years and tried to study as many Indigenous studies and decolonial studies classes as I tried to take as many of those as I could with my schedule. But ethnic studies in general is an interdisciplinary study of the history of colonized, racialized, and enslaved peoples in the US primarily, although it covers the global history that entails. And I think maybe part of that was just the route that I took that it was more based in the US. But one thing that kept coming up in those classes for a host of reasons was just the importance of stories and telling stories. And one way it struck home for me was I also studied economics at UC San Diego, and I found it interesting that a lot of the research that was covering discrimination and inequality, the researchers seem to be at a loss for why racial differences in things like wages and things like that still continue to persist despite progress in the area of civil rights in the US. And the literature talked about an unexplained variable accounting for these gaps after doing all of their controls, which is what researchers do. They try to control for all the factors and have just one variable that's changing and hold it against the constant. So you all know that. But a lot of the papers said they couldn't figure out exactly why these differences continue. Like I said, despite there being progress in the area of civil rights and race not being on the surface as much as it was pre 60s and earlier. So I think stories would help in a lot of social science research, especially economics, and then we'll talk about why it's important in studying history in general, just to kind of fill in some of those gaps and bring in the historical context and things like that that paints a fuller picture. And also through my upbringing, I had the privilege to go through some like nature-based learning programs. One was a wilderness camp when I was a teenager, and then I went to a school that was like about tracking animals and learning bird identification and bird calls and like plants as food and a more in-depth nature awareness school, and found that sort of the ways of teaching in those schools is not valued in society in general, and that it was even a new thing for me to learn in the ways that they were teaching, even though these were the ways that they thought about approaching nature and looking at humans' place in it seemed to share similar themes across, even in different schools, and started with like different lineages concerning like the systems of knowledge that they were using to teach. And they had these similar threads. And so I started to sort of walk back how it was that I was brought up to think about these different ways of knowing and the Western approaches in science and things like that. And just thought that some of the ways that Native peoples view themselves and the world around them and organize knowledge and create systems of education could be useful in solving some of these social problems like inequality and environmental degradation and hunger and things like that. So, but the most important reason why I started reading stories by Native authors was that I've seen the ways that um, Native folks have been uh, blocked access to tell their own stories in some of the cultural institutions in the US, like the government and the law and academia. Um, since day one, Native folks have had their ways of thinking squashed out uh, systematically, and that means lacking the not giving being blocked access to tell their own stories and determine their own futures because of that. And so I wanted to just provide a space where I'm like kind of teaching a little bit of what I learned in ethnic studies. And there's like way more that can be said about all the stuff we've talked about. I'm just a noob with a bachelor's degree and got a really general, broad view, but wanted to just highlight these authors and allow their voices to just speak for themselves and be I guess like just provide a space once a week on Zoom where where those authors are able to speak. And I think a lot of people in my community probably got a same sort of upbringing in public school and stuff where we got this sort of Hollywood version of Native folks, and it's like this flattened story uh, that's just a product of all those things that I mentioned before about, I guess, just the colonization and the U.S. And what it's like being brought up in the U.S. And so I wanted to bring like stories in to create like a third dimension and complicate these people who have been like flattened in the narratives, and to um, just allow a space where it can be rehumanized and have a more fuller picture. So one of the ways we talked about doing this was in Avery Gordon's piece, Her Shape in His Hand, where Patricia Williams was quoted, who I quoted at the beginning. Um, and Williams talked about the search for historical evidence of her enslaved great great grandmother. Does anybody on here remember that piece that we read? It's called Her Shape in His Hand. Nadine is raising her hand. Cool. Emmett remembers. So I won't read it, but I just talked about the difficulty it was sort of finding historical evidence for her great great grandmother, because the only way she had a record of finding of her great great grandmother was through the records that her owner kept. Her owner was a lawyer, and his sons were also lawyers, and she had to search through those records and journals that he kept to find evidence of her great great grandmother. And that's why it's called Her Shape in His Hand. Williams says, I look for her shape in his hand, and she can see the way that her life is shaped by the the hand of the owner of her great great grandmother. And to Avery Gordon goes on to say that that project is one that is it's a project of, let me just look it up. It's a project where haunting and phantoms play a part. And I think that has to do with like what us as researchers deal with when we're trying to do historical research into the lives of colonized peoples, where we're only given those bits of information, but also we're like inheriting this um, these records that are going to be painted by the people who had the power to tell the stories at that time. So they're colored by those views. And so the haunting and the phantoms means we have to like sort of fill in the gaps, and I guess take it with a grain of salt, knowing that certain peoples were not allowed to tell their own stories. And so to do sociological research in the present, we have to account for all of that bias and um, just beliefs of those people and what that meant for the people who were being researched to not who weren't able to tell their own stories. So that's how that ties in. And then we've also talked about um, the importance for Native peoples to tell their own stories based in. We brought up the open letter that Unangak scholar Eve Tuck wrote to researchers and Indigenous communities and just I guess grassroots organizers, people like that. She wrote an open letter called "Suspending Damage," where she called for scholars and researchers to move away from the commonly accepted approach of doing sociological and social scientific research, which usually relies on establishing damage in the community first in order to start theorizing change. And she called for what she named desire-based research, saying that the damage-centered research will often like pathologize the communities involved from the outset, um, and so therefore was saying that focusing on a desire-based framework, which she goes into in the letter, could help to actually increase that access to self-determination and sovereignty that we were talking about. And one last thing, as Tuck puts it in that letter, she says this type of research in Native communities comes by way of quote, teeth counting, rib counting, head measuring, blood drawn, bones dug up, medical treatment withheld, erroneous or fabricated ethnography, unsanctioned camera lenses, out and out lies, empty promises, cover ups, betrayals. And she goes on saying, these are the stories of our kitchen tables. These are the stories of First Alaska and Native America and of many communities across the United States and the globe. They are the finger-shaped bruises on our pulse points. And that just really points to why I think the native storytelling is important, because it reclaims that space of telling their own story, especially in these knowledge producing institutions like academia, that's ultimately going to lead to policy. And just to tie that all together, I think just dealing with all of that historical context and knowing sort of just thinking about who's had the power to tell the stories is an important part of this whole Zoom story time thing that I'm trying to do. And then moving into the like nature based thing, I just want to continue to hold that, and like we'll keep going back and forth, I guess, and probably visit like Leanne Betasamosake Simpson's piece "Land as Pedagogy," where I think we read that week 2 that talks about the squirrel Adijamu, which is the Anishinaabe word I think for red squirrel. Kind of, it's an interesting story about land-based knowledge, and but just wanted to like kind of rehash that before we moved on. And um, let me see what the last thing I wanted to say. I think I just wanted to give my credentials a little bit. So I lived in the desert for 49 days as part of like a nature therapy program. We would cook on open fires that we started with a bow drill or a hand drill. And if we couldn't get a fire, we just had to resort to eating cold oats or make do with what we had or could find. And often we would even run out of food like by Monday and Tuesday, and wouldn't get resupplied until Wednesday at that camp. So we had to be resourceful. We ate a lot of thistle on Mondays and Tuesdays and would like trade for lentils, which is what everyone had left on Monday or Tuesday. And then I've also done survival trips. I've done a couple survival trips. One was 4 days with 22 other adults at the end of the wilderness school that I went to, um, like drinking from a spring and just eating plants for days and days. But we slept well and I learned a lot. And then I led a group of Boy Scouts on a high adventure trip, like a group of 15 to 18-year-olds, where we camped in a campground for a couple days and nights, and I mentored them kind of in a similar way that I'll be leading this upcoming like Storytime 2.0. So I have a lot of experience with this. I think it'll be really fun. And if you dedicate a little bit of time to putting in practice with the few like routines that we'll learn about, I think it might even be fairly transformative, depending like however deep you want to take it. And if you want to just show up for the stories each week, that's totally cool too. I really appreciate you all joining. And I'm really excited for this second part. It's still gonna be. I have like one more reading that I wanted to do today. Uh, that's honestly one of the like headier pieces. I didn't read any like um I guess like critical theory, but this one is more like an academic paper, but it's really cool. Um, it just might be a little bit heady, but it really ties in everything that we've talked about, I think, really well. Um, and it's from Tasha Hubbard and a piece called The Buffaloes Are Gone, quote unquote, or quote, Return Buffalo. Sorry, it's a really complicated title. The Buffaloes Are Gone, or Return Buffalo? Question mark. The relationship of the buffalo to indigenous creative expression. And it says, while the depletion of the buffalo has been understood as a contributing factor in the subjugation of Plains indigenous people, what has had less attention is the attack on the integral relationship between the buffalo and indigenous people. The relationship, like other relationships between the natural world and indigenous people, brings together animal and human into a symbiotic relationship that incorporates respect, survival, spirituality, and cultural expression. By replacing the value of stories about the buffalo, we can reinstate this animal and others as sites of learning, which can then result in a revitalization of creativity and literary expression. And we won't read the whole thing, but I'll just read a few pages at the end. The beginning sort of talks about just the ways that buffalo have been painted as it's kind of already gone in a lot of the art and literature in early America. Um, but also that's not the case, that the buffalo are coming back. Um, so where am I starting? So, countering the established myths of disappearance, both for the buffalo and the trope of the vanishing Indian, are the efforts made by Indigenous artists who insist on presenting works that represent selfhood in close relationship with the natural world. Quote, when we assert our own meanings and philosophies of representation, we render the divisions irrelevant and maintain our aboriginal right to name ourselves. These moves toward re-emergence found in creative and critical works by Native writers renews and asserts a sacred buffalo teaching practice. Writers and artists, quote, construct a way of seeing the buffalo that details the representational myopia of centuries of polarized history. That cultural myopia is the imperial gaze that would read Native representations, like Native lands, as property in the public domain. Specific works from writers such as James Welsh, Linda Hogan, and filmmaker Dana Claxon reflect the interrelationship between humans and the buffalo. Welch's historical novel, Fool's Crow, presents a world informed by Blackfeet cosmology and language, where a people's relationship with the, quote, Blackhorns, or buffalo, has sustained them for generations and for whom great change is near. The title character is a man who, quote, is part of a continuum of connections between people, animals, mountains, stars, cycles of seasons, and ceremonies stretching into the mythic past. At the end of the novel, Fool's Crow travels to a different world where he is given the gift of foresight through an image painted on a skin by the deity Feather Woman. He is able to see what the future holds for him and his people. And this is an excerpt. He searched around the Sweetgrass Hills, the Yellow River, the river where the shield floated away, Snake Butte and Round Butte, but he did not find the Blackhorns. He looked along the breaks north of the big river, and he looked to the country of the hard gooseneck and the white grass butte, the meat strings. But there were no Blackhorns. It was as if the earth had swallowed up the animals. Where once there were rivers of dark Blackhorns, now there were none. This is back into the text. It is a terrible shock to him as he sees the coming soldiers, starvation, and death. Images fade and he experiences despair. However, the skin also reveals another vision. Blackfeet children attending residential school, hemmed in by a fence. While seemingly trapped in a site of indoctrination, the children are revealed to be resilient. Feather Woman assures Fool's Crow that these children, quote, will know the way it was. The stories will be handed down, and they will see their people were proud and lived in accordance with the below ones, the underwater people, and the above ones. Stories are reinforced as sites of resistance, but also as sites where knowledge of the Blackfeet way of life will remain and be available. I think that's a really important part. These stories are reinforced as sites of resistance, but also sites where knowledge of the Blackfeet way of life will remain and be available. So Welch ends the novel with a potential prophecy of the buffalo's return to the people, as Fool's Crow and his family prepare for the difficulties awaiting them out away from their camp. Quote, rivers of great animals moved. Their backs were dark with rain, and the rain gathered and trickled down their shaggy heads. Some grazed, some slept. Some had begun to molt. Their dark horns glistened in the rain as they stood guard over the sleeping calves. The black horns had returned, and all around it was as it should be. End quote. All of the actions of the buffaloes in this passage suggest cycles of movement, life, and beauty. The central question one must ask is this another world or another time? Welch does not make this clear to us, but the last line, it was as it should be, gestures to the possibility of hope and renewal, despite times of darkness. I hope the metaphors are like coming through about the buffalo and indigenous people. So the buffalo in Linda Hogan's poem, Return Buffalo, begins as a marker of the impact of the buffalo slaughter on indigenous peoples. It manifests as a scar on the narrator's heart and as a brother, quote, a brother who heard the bellowing cry of sacred hills when nothing was there but stories and rocks. It was what the ghost dancers heard in their dream of bringing buffalo down from the sky, as if song and prayer were paths life would follow back to land. But by evoking the ghost dance, Hogan opens up possibilities for the buffalo's significance. Most scholars see the ghost dance prophecy as a promise of pre-European plentifulness embodied by the return of deceased relatives and the buffalo itself if the dance's protocols were followed. Sake Henderson asserts that it was actually, quote, a sustained vision of how to resist colonization. He provides an alternative view of what the ghost dance meant. Quote, it was a vision of how to release all the spirits contained in the old ceremonies and rites. The dance released these contained spirits or forces back into the deep caves of Mother Earth, where they would be immune from colonizers' strategies and techniques. Their efforts were a noble sacrifice for future generations. So in her poem, Hogan's lone surviving buffalo is a metaphor, evidence that spirits and teachings will also survive, emerging out of the earth, when the time is right. Quote, the dance would allow the spiritual teachings to renew the ecology, and eventually the forces of the ecology would forge a traditional consciousness of the following generations, end quote. While scarred, the buffalo's survival mirrors that of indigenous people who are also marked but still alive. As one critic points out, the buffalo's present return is a final marker of colonial impotence, or of a failure of American exceptionalism, of the diluted impossibility of the 500-year project to, quote, vanish the Indian. In this way, the buffalo embodies the struggle against the forces of colonialism, colonialism's subsequent failure to eradicate and erase indigenous presence from the land, and the return of both indigenous physical presence and creative consciousness. McLeod, sorry, I got lost. McLeod reminds us that it is within our spiritual narratives that we find who we are as indigenous people. As he writes, the narratives also point to relationships between humans and other beings, and to the possibilities of radically reimagining constructed social spaces. I would argue that indigenous creative expression contributes to that effort. It is not just the written or artistic passage where this creativity can be found. Works done in new media are another location where indigenous creators are creating and animating in animated spaces. I'm gonna skip this next part, and there's just like two more pages. In her aforementioned essay, not even 2 pages. So in her aforementioned essay, First People, Hogan refers to Alex Whiteplume, a Lakota who works towards the restoration of the buffalo on reservations. He says that as the buffalo were returning, the people too returned to the traditions, stories, and the language. Others have also remarked on the symbolic relationship between the buffalo and indigenous people in the context of continued survival and renewal. Vine Deloria Jr. states, the plains were and are a covenant between human and bison. Our bones go back to the ground to become the dust that nourishes the grasses that feed the buffalo. Just as indigenous bones nourish the buffalo, its presence nourishes indigenous thought and creativity and continued life on this land. Batiste asserts that we are all virtually new and continuing learners. Indigenous people must continue to learn from our elders, cultural leaders, and others about knowledge not cultivated in schools and universities. One of the teachings which deserves more attention in literary circles is the role of Indigenous people's relationship with the animal world, and specifically for Plains people, the buffalo. Having a strong understanding of how the buffalo presence sustained us in the past and how it can continue to do so in the future is integral to Plains Indigenous expression. Western education practices do have value for Indigenous peoples, and education can continue to be seen as our buffalo, but not to the exclusion of the buffalo's role as our educator. In this way, the buffalo can be seen as a guide between the two worlds referred to by Kahete and Little Bear. We must re-envision concepts of humanities and creativity as performance, or doing, or living. Actions bring humanity and creativity to life, and doing and being turn life into knowledge and wisdom. They perform an animated and animating curriculum that can educate us all, if we allow it to. That was all Batiste. Batiste et al. The buffalo's role as educator should not be exclusive to indigenous peoples, and thus the buffalo's teachings can have important influence on non-indigenous peoples to have a new understanding of the land they inhabit and their place on it. The buffalo's survival and reemergence in population, despite near extinction, can be seen as a symbol of hope and renewal expressed through our stories. An old Lakota ghost dance song foretells the return of the buffalo to the plains. Perhaps now is the time when the buffalo have returned, and now it is time for us to listen to the stories that teach us our worldview, hold our indigenous knowledge, and articulate our indigenous theory. The whole world is coming. A nation is coming. A nation is coming. The eagle has brought the message to the tribe. The Father says so. The Father says so. Over the whole earth they are coming. The buffalo are coming. The buffalo are coming. The crow has brought the message to the tribe. The Father says so. The Father says so. I wanted to read that piece. I hope some of the themes like kind of summed up a lot of what we talked about for you all as it did for me. Kind of dealing with like the misnomer or whatever of native peoples is like already gone or always gone or like always primitive or something relegated to the past, including indigenous knowledge. And I think that idea about the ghost dance saying that the buffalo went underground as a sacrifice and not a product of colonization, but a way to resist colonization and reemerge and be a site of teaching is like a super important concept.